I've picked out 5 of my favourite books that I think you should read if you're into video gaming history like I am. I love reading about the history of games, and the first one on the list we've got here is called Ask Iwata. I actually thought this book was going to be snippets from the Iwata Asks interviews that he used to do on the Nintendo website, but it actually turns out that this book is much more interesting than that. It is actually Iwata's own writing that he used to do for a website. If I go to the right page here, we can find out what that was called. For a website called Hobo Nikan Itoi Shinbun. I apologise for the terrible pronunciation of that entire website title right there, but basically why this was so interesting to me, it goes through basically his history as starting off as a game designer, well, starting off from his high school years, as you can see on this page here, discovering programming with calculators, making friends at the computer store, founding HAL Laboratories and how he worked with them before he got picked up by Nintendo, and then of course went on to work as the president for Nintendo, and you kind of get to know him as a businessman as well as a game creator, and it was just a really fascinating read. I'm flicking through some of the pages here so you can kind of see the formatting of the book and some of the sort of key highlights. They do highlight a few different aspects of his sort of business style and basically finding out how to work with people in that, and you know, making sure that the games are ready to sell. And it is such a fascinating read, and it is nothing like what I expected. So definitely check out Ask Iwata. There'll be links to all of these books down in the description. The second one is an absolute classic. This is The History of Nintendo from 1889 to 1980. And this was by a French person called Florent Gorges. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And he is very famous in the retro gaming community. He is easily one of the most well-researched people when it comes to the history of Nintendo. There's a bit of a description about him right there, so I'll zoom in on that so you can have a look. And this book is just an absolute masterpiece. It goes through everything that Nintendo worked on, the history of Nintendo, all the way back to the 1800s, and there's loads of really interesting photos of the Nintendo HQ at the time, and just what was going on in Japan around that time as well. And what's really exciting is that the interior of Nintendo's offices here, recently that's actually been opened up in Japan as a hotel, and I would love to try and go and stay there and have a look at all of the memorabilia and everything that they've managed to sort of bring up to modern day standards. Apparently they've done a lot to make use of the existing furniture and things, which is really cool. So as you can see in the book, it also includes all of their trading cards, a look into the old factories. There's just so much information here, and it was just an absolute joy to read through. It does end when it gets to video games. If you go right to the back, there's a little bit about their early arcade years, which I also find really fascinating as well, and their very first ever video game, well, if you can call it a video game. It was actually this here called the EVR Race, which is basically one of those gambling machines in the arcades, except it had a computer monitor and it was actually programmed to do different races, and that's really interesting. And as you can see, there's also a few different versions of it here, as well as this sort of shooting gallery style game, which was also a sort of video thing as well. And then it goes into a little bit about some of their other shooting gallery stuff. And I absolutely recommend this book. There are a few more. There was a Game & Watch one, which also came out in the UK, and then there was a further one about the history of the Game Boy, I believe, which didn't come out yet in English. I really hope it does, so fingers crossed that the translator who translated the other books gets around to that at some point, because I really want to read more. This guy is just incredible when it comes to gaming history. Now, on to book number 3. This is the oldest book that I've got here. This one was actually released in 1993, and this is called Game Over: Nintendo's Battle to Dominate an Industry. This is by David Sheff, and this is just an incredible book that goes into an insane amount of detail about the history of Nintendo, all the way back to even before Nintendo made playing cards, all the way back to the Yamauchi family and how they grew up and everything. It was such a fascinating read, and the amount of detail that this goes into is just beyond anything else that I've ever read. And the way he paints a picture, like here, it's talking about a Kyoto business district, and the way he's worded everything in this book, it's almost like you're there with them. So you can imagine, say, Hank Rogers going into Nintendo's headquarters and playing Go with Hiroshi Yamauchi, and you just get a sense of what the atmosphere was like in the room and everything. It's such an incredible read, and I do actually want to go back and reread it at some point in the future. Of course, being written in 1993, it actually only goes up to around the launch of the SNES. There was a version that came out a few years later that carried on up to the N64 era, but either way, considering the age of this book, it's such a fascinating read, and I haven't read anything that goes into as much detail as this one does, and it still holds up to the test of time as well. So Game Over by David Sheff is an absolute #1 recommendation from me. Definitely read it if you haven't already. Now for a more modern book, this one is actually a compilation of a few separate volumes of books which I've covered on the channel before, called The Untold History of Japanese Game Developers. This is called Japansoft, an oral history, and like I said, this basically takes those books and it actually formats them in a really nice way, because one of the issues a lot of people had with those books was the formatting, whereas this has been really nicely edited. As you can see, it's got some really nice clear pages, it's got some nice separating the different elements out, and it's put things into categories that make a lot more sense than the originals. So I really enjoyed rereading this. It's got a really interesting set of topics in here as well, and some really nice photographic pages in the middle too. So if you're interested in Japanese gaming history, then if you don't really fancy reading through 4 volumes of insane detail but also kind of messy formatting, if I'm being completely honest, then this is a great entry point into that whole series. But I still definitely recommend you going and checking out all of the Untold history books if you are interested, and this is a good glimpse into what those books offer. So definitely check this out, and then check out my video up here on the eye in the corner or down in the description to find out more about the Japanese history series. It is so good. And a kind of interesting book for the last one that I'm going to show off here. This is the Haynes Video Gaming Manual. And this is something that I got back at college when I was first properly getting into collecting retro games and really getting into that whole scene. And it was this book, partially this book, that is to thank for my collection behind me right here. So it is only a short book, it's only got 176 pages, but what is here is absolute gold. As you can see on this contents page, it covers loads of interesting systems, basically all the systems you could really care about. It goes into a little brief history of video games. Obviously this was in 2009, so Super Mario Galaxy is probably one of the most recent games in this book. But the thing that I loved about this more than anything was the actual discussion around the individual systems themselves. So let's skip forward a bit here. So for example here, there's a page here on the ZX Spectrum. It has a little bit of a history of the console, it has a timeline, it has, you know, an overview of the system, and then the great thing is it has these pages here which are the key titles for that system. And of course it was released back in 2009 at this point, but because this is all retro related, everything is just as interesting and informative now as it was back then too. So it was really great for me to be able to read this and get an idea about these microcomputers that I don't really have any involvement with. I'm more of a console guy myself, but when I did get a Commodore 64, for example, this page here is something that I came to try and track down some of these games, and it has been a great resource for that. And obviously it goes through loads of different consoles and computers, even some Japanese ones as well, like the PC Engine here. So if you are interested in game collecting, then the best place to start, in my opinion, is the Haynes Video Game Manual. Let me know down in the comments below what books you would recommend as well. Maybe people watching this can go and check some of those out too. As I said, check the description for links to all of these, and hopefully I'll do more of these in the future, because I have read a lot of books about gaming history, and there's also a lot that I want to read as well. And maybe I'll write my own one day too. Anyway, that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, of course, consider checking out Patreon to join everyone going across the side of the screen here. And if you do want to check out my Untold History of Japanese Game Developers video, then click up here and watch that one next. Goodbye.